Welcome to Iran, a country with a pivotal role in a region in turmoil. In Gaza, health ministry numbers show the death toll has now passed 30,000 people. And growing desperation has led to even more tragedy near Gaza City. Palestinian health officials say Israeli troops opened fire on a crowd waiting for food aid, killing 112 people and injuring 760 others. It happened at around 4 a.m. local time as a convoy of aid trucks moved north along Al-Rashid Street, passing through an Israeli checkpoint near Nabulsi roundabout. Israeli officials acknowledged their troops opened fire, but say many people were trampled on or run over after storming the aid trucks. Hamas is warning that it could jeopardise the ceasefire talks going on in Qatar. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, reports from Jerusalem.
Desperate scenes at Kamal Edwan Hospital in Jabalia as dozens of injured people were brought in after a crowd rushed aid trucks in the early hours of this morning and were reportedly shot by Israeli soldiers.
What happened was that yesterday we received information that aid would be dropped in the Nabulsi roundabout area. All the people from the northern Gaza Strip were there with us, heading to the same place. Then, at 5 to 4, we were surprised by Israeli tanks that came out and opened fire on people randomly and directly. Immediately afterward, all we found were martyrs, the injured and the wounded scattered on the ground in a chaotic and horrifying manner.
The dead and injured were transported by donkey cart and stretcher along the beach road where the truck convoy had been moving. It seems more likely that they were victims of small arms than tank rounds, probably fired from a nearby Israel Defense Forces checkpoint. The IDF has a different version of events. They've released edited drone footage that they say shows people climbing over the trucks, and claim that the motionless people on the ground died in a stampede or by being run over. They say later, in a separate incident, their soldiers shot people who refused to turn back when warned not to approach a checkpoint. This contradicts eyewitness reports. Some of the injured were taken to Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. Their testimony and that of other eyewitnesses is similar to those at Kamal Edwan Hospital.
We ran towards the food aid to get some. The soldiers and tanks fired at us. The people in the front and the back were shot, some in the hand, others in the legs. We left the food aid and ran.
An injured man at Al-Shifa Hospital says they were shot at twice.
After they stopped shooting, we went back to get our aid. By the time I got flour and some canned goods and took it down from the truck, they shot at us. They shot me, and the truck driver left and ran over my leg.
Social media footage shows that similar recent convoys have been mobbed too. People are desperate to get food for their hungry children. The police no longer dare guard aid trucks because they fear Israel will target them as part of Hamas. No wonder law and order is breaking down. The hospitals treating today's victims are barely functioning. Medical supplies like food are scarce, partly because Israel isn't allowing enough in, especially to the north of the Strip, and partly because of the lack of security for aid convoys. You can be shot, or starve, or succumb to your injuries. So many ways to die in Gaza. We're really talking about two separate issues here. The first is, did the Israeli Defense Forces fire into a crowd of unarmed, desperate, hungry Gazan civilians? If they did, and they deny it, then that is potentially a war crime. And that is very serious, obviously. And what was said on the ground and what the Israeli Defense Forces have said to us completely contradicts each other. But there's another issue. There's a context for this. And that is why people are so desperate. I've been talking to senior UN officials over the last 2 days. This is what they tell me, that they have not been able to get any aid trucks into northern Gaza for more than a month now. And that means that malnutrition rates are absolutely skyrocketing. They have never seen malnutrition rates go up so quickly amongst children. What that means is that the children's parents are absolutely desperate. At the same time, because Hamas is no longer a government there, and because the police have melted away because they're afraid of being targeted, there is no security. There is no security for the trucks. That's why the trucks get mobbed. People who are desperate for food to feed their children, there's no one to stop them doing this. And that's what anyone would do. That's what you would do if your family was starving and there was no law and order to stop you. And if there is no ceasefire, these officials say, and if more aid doesn't get in very quickly, we're going to see more terrible incidents and more death.
Lindsay Hilson in Jerusalem. Well, in a minute we hope to be speaking to the IDF live, but earlier I spoke to Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a former State Department diplomat who spent decades negotiating for peace in the Middle East. I began by asking how an event like today's killing of Gazans waiting for food could impact the ceasefire talks going on right now.
It is the two combatants that determine the trajectory, the intensity, and the prospects for de-escalation in this conflict. And frankly, right now, I see very little urgency on the part of either Hamas or Israel to come to a quick agreement, in large part because the issues surrounding what would lead to an agreement probably have little or nothing to do with what happened on the ground in Gaza today. In that sense, it may actually complicate matters. Hamas may well decide to let the public relations nightmare that this is going to cause for the Israelis to play out a little longer, hoping that it will increase pressure from the Biden administration on the Netanyahu government to push for more favorable terms for a prisoner for hostage release. So I don't expect this incident, frankly, to operate in a positive way.
Are these talks, though, going on two levels? You know, on one level, they are there to bring about a ceasefire right now and get the hostages out, but they're also aimed at a longer-term settlement, and presumably Hamas want to increase the pressure for serious two-state solution talks.
I don't think Hamas has any interest in a two-state solution. I think what Hamas wants, basically, is to survive this, to release as many Palestinian prisoners, particularly security prisoners, with blood on their hands, hoping that international pressure will mount to create a situation where the Israelis will be forced to withdraw from densely populated areas in Gaza or from the Gaza Strip entirely. So again, even if you get by Ramadan, March 10, a prisoner hostage exchange, it's only an interim limited exchange. I fear that this conflict is going to continue for months.
And how do you think the United States and the Middle Eastern players in Qatar should be treating Iran right now, where I'm speaking to you from, where tonight's event is being portrayed as another chapter in genocide, where they talk about the West as enablers of that genocide and deniers of the truth. I mean, is there any way that this nation can seriously interface with the United States at talks?
I don't think so. I think that any sort of transformational change in the U.S.-Iranian relation will not be possible. The best the U.S. and Iran can do is to come to limited understandings, what I would call transactional agreements, to manage the conflict and prevent what I think neither wants, which is an all-out military confrontation. Clearly, the Iranians don't want that, and I don't think the Biden administration wants it as well. So with Iran, it's a management exercise, and I'm afraid it has its ups and its downs.
Aaron David Miller, thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Well, joining me now from Tel Aviv is Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces. Lieutenant Colonel, eyewitnesses say that more than 100 Palestinians died when Israeli soldiers fired on numerous occasions into a crowd. Do you take responsibility for those deaths?
No, of course not, because those claims are blatantly lies. The IDF conducted a humanitarian operation this morning in order to assist and facilitate the movement of food supplies, as we have been doing over the last 4 days in a similar manner. The supplies went in, passed through our positions, and then continued to move forward, where a mob stormed the convoy, bringing it to at some stage to a halt. But in the state of chaos on the site, people were being pushed, trampled, and in some cases run over.
When you say a mob, do you mean starving people who have been deprived of food because you haven't let the aid in? The UN officials told us that no aid has been allowed into northern Gaza for more than a month.
The UN obviously aren't up to date on their information. The last 4 days, convoys, like we conducted this morning was 38 truckloads, passed into northern Gaza to distribute food supplies, which are international donations, but on private vehicles that were conducting the convoy into northern Gaza.
Well,
so
multiple agencies say some aid is going in, but not nearly enough. And you spoke of a mob. I want to put to you what Save the Children said. They said, while children die from lack of food, their parents are killed trying to get it for them. That's the reality, isn't it? These are starving people, desperate for anything they can get their hands on.
Kathy, the incident on the convoy this morning was nothing to do with Israel. The IDF secured the convoy, it went through, and it got out of hand on the ground as people were looting the trucks.
Yeah, but your troops fired shots.
No, there were warning shots fired, and then when it got out of hand, the forces retreated back into the formation along the Gaza Wadi area. That was not true. That is just a blatant lie. That is absolutely inaccurate.
So why do you think people are so angry then?
I think there is a lot of things that are going on in these days. And of course, there is a dire situation in the Gaza Strip, a human tragedy. And that is precisely why we are facilitating humanitarian actions like this morning, or the airdrops of supplies into Gaza, both in the north and in the south, or the continued access and movement through Rafah or through Kerem Shalom crossing. Of course, there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of frustration precisely because Hamas launched the war on the 7th of October, and now is hiding behind the people of Gaza.
Yeah, but you are now responsible for law and order in Gaza, and law and order has broken down, and that is on you, isn't it?
No, the reality is one where we are still in a combat zone. And indeed, there are civilians in that area, and we are doing everything in order to distinguish, in order to conduct our operations based on the military necessity, while we get people out of harm's way, while we try and supply and facilitate the access of humanitarian goods. And the reality is one which it will continue to be extremely challenging. I would argue that there has been no similar operation, similar war conditions, similar urban environment warfare in modern history. And Israel is facing a huge challenge. Absolutely.
And you are still intending to press ahead with an invasion in Rafah in the south. There are 1.4 million people trapped there. No humanitarian evacuation plan can redistribute those people in an area that you've bombed in the north.
Kathy, there are 134 Israelis that remain in the clutches of Hamas. The war can end tonight. We don't need to wait. They can release the hostages, bring them home, unconditionally surrender so that they do not have that power of government to launch another 7th of October, and the war could be over. What we know from our rescue operation 2 weeks ago is that there are hostages in Rafah. There are fighters in Rafah. They conducted, our operation was conducted over extensive fire.
And there's more than a million civilians there too.
And indeed, we've presented to the government, to the Prime Minister, our operational plan and evacuation plan. And indeed, if and when we need to mobilize, the instructions will be given to the population to evacuate from the stations that we need to operate in.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Lerner, thank you very much.